now. And so okay, so retirement is what are you doing with your spare time right now?
I take a hike somewhere in the various parks around this part of the Atlanta metro area every day, get my exercise and photograph wildlife. And I like
Awesome.
to collect things, so I go out to thrift stores and estate sales and looking for especially signed books, and then I keep some and I sell others online. So those keep me busy.
That's
Do some traveling.
that sounds like a fun little hobby you have
It's fun,
there.
yeah.
So,
Treasure hunt.
right. I could get into that. That's cool. Well, let's get started by asking you just some of the basics. Where are you originally from?
I'm originally from Latrobe, Pennsylvania. That's about 40 miles east of Pittsburgh.
Okay, which is where you got your email from.
Yeah,
Okay, okay. And then how did you get into meteorology? How did you end up at the University of Chicago?
I had a seventh grade science class where the teacher, I think, had been an observer in the Navy. And so he taught a module that year that was about weather and meteorology. And I had us draw some weather maps and went out and looked at clouds. And about that same time, Joe DiNardo and Bob Cudzmore were TV actual meteorologists on the Pittsburgh channels. At that time, you could get Captain Kangaroo just as easily doing the TV weather. It
Right.
wasn't like now when you had all meteorologists. So between those three guys, it showed me really that meteorology was a profession. And at that point, I kind of knew I wanted to be a scientist, but I wasn't sure what kind. But them showing me that meteorology was an actual science and you could make forecasts and then find out if you're right or wrong the next day. Unlike if you're a geologist, it might be thousands of years before the next volcano eruption that you predicted. So I thought, well, that sounds like my kind of thing, and I can help people. We lived out in the country. If it was a sunny day, my mother would wash clothes and hang them outside to dry on a line instead of using the dryer. And so I thought, well, this would be pretty good. And fortunately, Penn State University was not too far away. You had to have pretty good grades to get into the University Park campus. So I studied real hard in high school and was able to get in there. And while I was at Penn State, which by the way is arguably the best meteorology program in the world.
Well, wait a
While I
minute
was
now.
at Penn,
I'm a boilermaker myself,
oh,
so I
okay,
don't
well,
know. I don't know if I can
that's a
agree
good
with
school
that.
too.
But go ahead.
And while I was there, they invited in a scientist from NESDIS, the satellite folks, who was one of the sponsors of some of the research that was being done by Dr. Fujita at the University of Chicago. And he brought along a lot of examples of the kind of things that Dr. Fujita was doing to analyze the weather and the Fujita scale and his detailed studies of tornadoes. And I thought, boy, that would be pretty cool. So I sent a letter to Dr. Fujita asking him if he had any assistantship funds that could support my being a graduate student there. And he wrote back and said, well, he didn't at the moment, but he thought he might be getting some funds. So I put off a couple of other schools waiting to hear from Dr. Fujita with fingers crossed, and he came through, and so off I went there and wound up getting my master's and PhD and was a postdoc under him for a while also before I went back to Penn State as a faculty member.
That is absolutely fantastic. When did you arrive? When did you arrive at University of Chicago?
The fall of 1972.
Oh, okay. So just enough time for you to kind of get acclimated before the big event hit.
Yeah, it was 1 year after he had 1 year after he had developed the Fujita scale. So that was just brand new and
Wow.
early stages of testing of that. So there was all sorts of exciting things he was doing using satellites. The geostationary satellites were brand new
Mhm.
then, and so he was doing cloud tracking, having us help him do some of the cloud tracking from those sequences of satellite imagery to try to estimate upper level winds over the oceans and things like that. So it was really exciting times, and then along came the super outbreak.
Right, which is just uh I mean, still to this day, 50 years later, people are still trying to wrap their minds around that particular event, which makes you in such a unique position, having worked directly under Dr. Fujita. and having been there personally to survey much of the scene, which I'm going to ask you about in a moment. So I want to take you back to somewhere around April 1st of 1974. And obviously the, outlooks put out by NOAA at the time were not great. I think it was the National Severe Storms Forecast Center at the time, prior to SPC. So I know they started talking about it a couple days before. What do you remember leading up to the events of April 3rd?
Well, the weather forecasting, as you say, was pretty crude back then, but there was some numerical weather forecasting, very, very crude, and it was predicting that weather conditions that sort of we knew on the large scale were favorable for severe weather tornado outbreaks were going to come to fruition on April 3rd. There was actually a moderate sized tornado outbreak ongoing on April 1st. And so the Storm Prediction Center and the National Weather Service sent out a message to all their offices that, hey, if you get a chance, take your radars down tomorrow, April 2nd. And because we think it's going to be a bad day on April 3rd, you're going to need those radars to be operating at peak efficiency. And so I was a weather forecaster. I did much of the weather forecasting for Dr. Fujita's field ventures, including subsequently Learjet flights. And so I was telling him, hey, we ought to be taking one of these Learjet flights on Wednesday to study the severe weather outbreak. But the funds for that had not yet come in. So we had to watch it from the University of Chicago. And there was some interesting things ongoing at that point. Tornado activity had been kind of in a bit of a lull. There had been that flurry of activity surrounding the F-scale development, but Dr. Fujita was starting to run short on research funds. So there was actually, I was being interviewed by someone from the National Center for Atmospheric Research to be perhaps a flight meteorologist on flights over the Atlantic Ocean out near Africa to study the formation of hurricanes from tropical disturbances coming off Africa. So had that super outbreak not happened, I might have wound up being a tropical meteorologist instead of a tornado meteorologist. But the outbreak happened later that evening. Dr. Fujita said, I think I'm going to get some new funding as a result of this big outbreak and needing to study it. And that's the way things turned out. I wound up finishing my career as a severe weather expert rather than a hurricane and tropical storm expert.
Which is pretty admirable. That's pretty cool. And does I have to ask this kind of on a side note? Does the Weather Channel still use your Torcon scale?
The Weather Channel still does use Torcon scale.
Mm-hmm.
It is, I'm not making it. It's the behind the scenes meteorologists that make the other forecasts are making that forecast along with their, forecast for temperature and rain and so on.
Yeah. Well, that's just so cool. To be able to have done everything that you have in your career. Now going back to
I was at Chicago for the Super Outbreak #1 in 1974, and I was at the Weather Channel predicting and then covering live the Super Outbreak 2011. So I got to be involved one way or another in both of the two sole outbreaks that have been so bad that we call them super outbreaks.
Right. Which, since you brought it up, I was going to ask at some point during this interview anyway for your, just a comparison between the two, as far as scale, magnitude, your thoughts on the two individual outbreaks and how they compare.
It's quite interesting. I did some detailed comparisons of those. There were more tornadoes on the 2011 outbreak. That one spanned parts of 3 days, and the one day had about 200 tornadoes. There were 148 tornadoes in a 24-hour period. That was pretty much the entire lifetime of the 1974 super outbreak. So the 2011 wins in number of tornadoes. 1974 wins, though, in number of violent tornadoes, F4 and F5 in the original F scale at that point. Now it's been changed to use the enhanced Fujita scale. And so there were about the same number of deaths. So both of them were very similar. The Super Outbreak 2011 covered a little bit more ground state-wise and time-wise. 1974 for an intense punch of tornadoes mainly in an 18-hour period. That one still stands by itself. But 2011 certainly was worse in some aspects as well.
Yeah, and it was fascinating to watch the 2011 event unfold as a meteorologist and as a weather enthusiast, and also as a person who studied severe weather outbreaks, particularly tornadoes, pretty much my entire life. So it was interesting to watch that in real time. I grew up, and just as a personal note, I grew up just extremely fascinated with the 74 event, and there's a few reasons why. First of all, my parents' and grandparents' homes were destroyed by one of the F5s, the first F5, the one that hit DePaul, Indiana.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, and they actually had to escape by automobile. They were able to escape the tornado with maybe 30 seconds to spare. So had they not got out when they did, I may not be here interviewing you today. So I grew up with that, and I wanted to learn, just hearing the stories from that day in the Louisville area, southern Indiana. Uh, it just instilled a fascination and then later a real passion for me to pursue and learn as much as I can about these storms. But one thing that I thought was very interesting, because I was reading some of the technical papers when I was very young from NOAA, including the synoptic technical analysis of what happened. And somewhere in there, the scientists that put that together had estimated that it was like a 500-year storm, which, I don't know how you judge such a thing. But that was in the paper somewhere, and I thought, well, I would never have an opportunity to see an outbreak anywhere close to that magnitude. And then April of 2011 came along, and suddenly we had something to compare it to.
Yeah, yeah. At that time in 1974, it was pretty much unprecedented. So, as you say, pretty hard to estimate what the frequency of recurrence of such a thing could be. But we now
Mhm.
see that it's maybe more like 40 or 50 years than 500.
Right, right. And one more thing about the 2011. So I like to look at the numbers, and I'm kind of a stat guy. And if you look at the bell curve when it comes to, EF0 through EF5, and you look at the two events, it doesn't, to me, either we missed a lot of the EF0s and EF1s in the 1974 event, or it just makes the 1974 event that much more strange that there were that many that were at the top of the scale. Can you talk to that at all?
Well, in 1974, most of the damage surveying that was done, as far as I know, was done by Dr. Fujita and his crew, including myself. And most of that, because it was such an extensive area, most of that was done by aircraft. And by aircraft, it's pretty hard to see F0, EF0 damage from the air. So it's
Right.
possible that there could have been some weak tornadoes that we didn't spot, but we were pretty careful. We would find some area that had major damage, and then we would fly backwards upstream and fly downwards to see not only did we get the beginning and ending of that tornado, but did we find another in the family either upstream or downstream? So we were looking pretty carefully, but there could have been some of these. So I'm pretty sure, got the tornadoes that were in these big long families, sequences of tornadoes from the same thunderstorm, one after the other. But it's possible that some of these stray peripheral tornadoes a few miles away on gust fronts or things like that from the storms, it's possible that we didn't get those. We were doing our initial surveying starting 2 days after the event, and but we continued then as we found reports the National Weather Service would tell us that they had heard of, or we looked in the newspapers, or got some kind of communication from people out in the tornado areas. We were out doing some follow-up damage surveys. I was even out into well into the summer doing follow-up damage surveys to try to fill in to verify or deny the tornadoes and update our counts. So we
Sure.
did as thorough a job as we could. The National Weather Service at that time individually did not really have the staff, or they were not charged with going out and doing surveys Now, because of the Doppler radars that are in place, National Weather Service puts an emphasis on, as much as they can, having their personnel go out and do damage surveys after the fact to get as accurate as possible information on tornado tracks and whether it was a tornado or just wind damage. But that wasn't the case back in 1974. So it's possible some tornadoes were missed, but certainly most of those tornadoes were, or so many of them got very violent and got that way pretty quickly along their path.
Which was just an amazing aspect to the storm, that so many of them had reached such strength. I mean, there were so many. I was reading the numbers of the number of F2 to F5s. It was like 90 plus.
Yeah.
F2 or greater in one day. And then you look at the F4s and F5s, which again, these storms individually are rare. And
Yes.
we on this day we had 30 of them. 30,
Yeah.
which is unfathomable. And especially the 7F5s, which there's really still nothing to compare that to.
That's right.
I think prior to April 3rd, 1974, there had never been more than two in a single day. And as you know, many times years will go by. Like
Yes.
right now, what is it? We got to go back more than a decade.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. The F5 tornadoes are pretty rare, and you can go several years without having one. That said, there's also some difference between then and now. It's harder, I think, now to get an EF5 tornado than it was back then. The enhanced Fujita scale is stricter in terms of that uppermost rating. You really have to have a pretty well built structure, an engineered structure that has very specific uh, meets fairly specific criteria of damage to get a 5 rating. Back then, the much looser Fujita scale, if you had, what appeared to be a fairly well built home that was blown off its foundation and crumbled into bits, there was nothing but litter downstream, that was going to get a 5 rating. That would, homes these days would pretty much generally not get a rating higher than 4. So it's possible that by today's standards, there might not have been as many F5 tornadoes back in 1974. The interesting thing is that the 74 super outbreak was actually the beginning of that elongated process that led to the enhanced Fujita scale. Just as the weather side and meteorology field was looking to do damage surveys to map this historical event, the engineering community was also funded to go out and do surveys to look, in their case, at the estimation of wind speeds using the structural factors or structural features. So there were engineers from Texas Tech University and other locations that were going out, and they were pretty much saying that the wind speeds in the Fujita scale for these F4 and F5 tornadoes are too high, that we're not seeing winds that were needed more than 220, 230 miles per hour to be doing this kind of damage. So that in those days would have been in the F4 category tops instead of the F5. Today, those with the EF5 being 200 plus, it's possible that if there really were 220, 230 mile per hour winds in the 1974 tornadoes, there could have been EF5 ratings, but getting them just on the basis of home destruction might have been a bigger challenge.
Sure.
The engineers were looking at like schools in Xenia, schools and other buildings that were concrete and steel, and not every tornado had those or maximum damage of those.
So in the days that followed April 3rd, and if you can remember during the actual event, at what point did you know the magnitude of the event? At what point did you know that this was history that was being made as far as the tornado outbreak was concerned?
Yeah, going into it, we were excited because we knew there was going to be a tornado outbreak. There was some question about how widespread it would be. Up in the Ohio Valley and north of the Ohio River, there was a question of whether or not it was going to be warm and unstable enough for tornadoes. And so it looked as if maybe it would be confined to the Gulf Coast states. But then once tornadoes started getting reported way up into the Midwest, we started, as got toward late afternoon, thinking that this is a worse tornado outbreak is in progress than we expected, and it could be historical. And then by evening, Dr. Fujita got a call from Alan Pearson of the National Severe Storms Forecast Center, and he said he told Ted that he better get ready for doing some damage surveying because this appears to be quite an outbreak. And watching the TV newscasts, they were getting reports in from Louisville and from Xenia and other places that had been hard hit. And so it was pretty clear at that point that a bad outbreak had taken place. But it wasn't really until we began to do the surveying that we found just how many tornadoes there had been in such a confined area in such a short period of time. The next day we divided up, Dr. Fujita divided up the area of preliminary reports of tornadoes into four sub areas, and 3 teams from the University of Chicago and 1 from Oklahoma National Severe Storms Lab then took off on flights starting on 2 days later to map out and photograph the damage pass. The Cessna aircraft I was in, it was 3 graduate students, none of which had ever flown in a Cessna before or done an aerial damage survey. So it was trial by fire, so to speak.
As long as your pilot had flown in the Cessna before, that's all that matters, right?
Yeah, he had, but there's some other stories to that. He had been sort of a flying, I forget whether it was down in the Bahamas, I think from island to island in the Bahamas. And so he had not flown in any kind of tornado aftermath either.
Right.
And so at times we got a little lower than we were supposed to go, trying to get good looks at details of the damage, and made the FAA angry about that. But so we didn't have a veteran damage surveying pilot. We had a veteran pilot.
Right. Well, sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness
permission.
than permission, right? Yeah, absolutely. Especially when it comes to something like that. That's cool. Now, so I understand that you were obviously you were on one of the survey teams. Can you describe to me which of the tornadoes or which areas that you got to survey?
Our initial survey area was from eastern and central Illinois up across western and northern Indiana into southern Michigan. So, for example, the Monticello, Indiana tornado was in our path, in our responsibility. We ironically got one of the longest individual tornadoes, went over 100 miles from parts of Illinois up into across a good stretch of Indiana, including across Monticello.
Yep.
And it was one of the longest of the whole outbreak. And so we're there trying to map this, and it just kept going and going and going. And we didn't really know the technique very well. I was in the back passenger seat, and the graduate student up front that was taking photographs in the passenger seat up front could see the track, but the plane was drifting over it. So sometimes then I would lose and say, I don't see any more damage. It was right under us. And so we'd have to go back. And so it was sort of learning by trial and error at that point.
Yeah, well, it's probably good that you had that long track to actual study that way, because you knew the damage was there. You just had to find it. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Well, that's very cool. Like I said, my family was down in southern Indiana at the time, and they were hit by the first F5, DePaul, Indiana, Palmyra, Daisy Hill, and I've actually got some photographs here from the actual tornado, and I've got this report. This wasn't the only one that came as a very asymmetric tornado with an ill-defined condensation funnel, but this is an actual photograph. You can see that.
I remember that we had seen that photograph back in 1974. That was really amazing. Yeah, a lot of those were sort of the wall cloud that were almost, it was rotating so violently it was almost down to the ground, and then because of the lack of moisture or the lack of dust underneath, you weren't getting well-defined tornadoes out of it. So So
Right.
yeah, that was one of the more amazing uh, cloud sequences that we had and that we had seen.
Yeah, and apparently this particular tornado. Now, the photograph you see here was actually taken at about the time the F5 damage occurred in
Yeah,
DePaul,
wow.
which is amazing. And if you look closely, and it's hard to tell from this photograph, and it's got somebody stamped it, but you can see the debris. It's not real visible. I'm
Yeah,
sure with modern cameras it would have shown up much better. But that particular tornado, and I've interviewed dozens of witnesses to that one, they all describe it like, well, most of them said, well, we weren't sure it was a tornado. They weren't sure what they were looking at. My family's personal story, they were looking at these clouds to the west. There was no warning on them per se, or at least not one that they had received. And they were living in a pair of mobile homes. So that was not a great place to be. They were looking to the west and just saw these clouds that just, grandpa and my uncle, David, said that it just made them feel uneasy. They weren't sure what they were looking at, but they just had a gut feeling they had to get out of there. But so many people had stories like that. They looked at it, they didn't initially recognize it as a tornado. Is there any insight you can bring into why there was a lack of a condensation funnel with some of those storms?
uh, well, one thing was it was still pretty early, and so there wasn't a whole lot of crops or anything like that on the ground to be throwing crop debris. Uh, and I don't remember whether it had been moist. I think it had probably been some rain ahead of that, so there wasn't a whole lot of dust either to be kicked up. So
Mhm.
uh, if you're going over forests where you can be pulling branches and leaves and things like that off of trees, that will help fill things in. But other than that, I don't have an explanation for that. But certainly, that kind of odd appearance to tornadoes instead of the classic funnel hose that comes all the way to the ground. That's what people were expecting to be looking for.
Right.
And they weren't seeing those kind of structures visually coming towards them. So it was difficult for them to really know that they were, in some cases, for them to know that they were in jeopardy. I think in this case, a lot of the tornadoes were did damage by the embedded section vortices, tornadoes within tornadoes. There were, when we looked aerially across fields of corn stubble, we could see very perfect patterns of these suction swaths, these
Mhm.
striation marks that were going through the fields, suggesting that there had been these suction vortices that have their own low pressure and their own additional counterclockwise spin and updraft that add to the winds of the parent tornado. So I think a lot of the damage was being done by the suction vortices that were just these little fingers coming down rather than having one big tornado funnel that came down and stayed down.
Right. Well, obviously that day was insane, and much of what you're talking about has been very well documented and described with the multi-vortex tornadoes. There was a bunch of them, as you know, as oftentimes that is the case for the top tier of tornadoes, F3, 4, and 5. Okay, so we've probably got about 5-10 minutes left during the interview before we kicked off Zoom. Sorry. So let me ask you just a couple more questions. First and foremost, what do you remember most about April 3rd or the damage surveys that you got to look at following the storm?
Well, one thing live during April 3rd was we had a rotating thunderstorm went right over the building at the University of Chicago, and one of the meteorologists came running into that interview that I was in and said, "Sorry to interrupt, but you probably want to come see this. There's a supercell over top of the building," and we all ran to the roof, and there was 1 inch hailstones or golf ball size hailstones coming down, and the storm got out over Lake Michigan and then put down a water spot there. So we didn't officially get a tornado. Uh, that's kind of the one thing I remember about the storm live, and then just the sheer magnitude of the damage that and the length of the paths that we saw doing some of those damage surveys, and then subsequently, I went out on the ground with Dr. Fujita to Louisville, to Brandenburg, down to Gulen, Alabama, and seeing some of the total destruction in those places that had been hit by, well, in the Gulen and Brandenburg cases, F5 tornadoes. That was pretty scary, and there was just nothing left. Everything had been destroyed.
Yeah, I covered the Brandenburg storm pretty thoroughly in a documentary I did about 10 years ago, and just what that town got hit with was unbelievable. The damage was unbelievable. And obviously 50 years later, people are still very much talking about it, and they want to know, can it happen again? And so I know that there was a consensus among meteorologists that once Doppler radar had been, implemented, and especially once we got into the era of dual pole and being able to identify exactly when a tornado touches down in many cases, and the advanced warning system that we had, the methods of communication that we had, I, th- I think the consensus was that we would never see another tornado that would kill 100 people or more. And then Joplin, Missouri happened in 2011, which changed all that. So, in your assessment, um, what is what? How bad could it be if we have another one of these type of a storms or outbreaks today? Knowing
Well,
all the failures that we have seen, since 2011, especially.
well, one of the big concerns these days is that what if we get a EF4 and EF5 tornado, a big wide one, moving fast through a metropolitan area, especially right if it's at, say, the evening rush hour when all sorts of vehicles are on the road, that there could be a huge, traffic jam that's set up, and then the tornado capable of picking up and tossing vehicles around. We could have a huge disaster in that case, and then hitting the high rises, breaking the window, flying glass. It's just a nightmare in terms of how bad things could happen. The other thing that's happened in the last 50 years also is that we've gotten more and more urban sprawl. So what used to be sort of little needles and haystacks in terms of tornado hitting or missing a city, now the city's much bigger, make much bigger targets. And so while we have better technology to predict and warn of the upcoming tornadoes, the urban sprawl and the traffic jams and the higher populations and concentrations make it a little bit harder, perhaps, to avoid the tornado. And of course, all the extra debris from the extra homes and buildings that are being damaged, that flying debris causes more impact force than just the winds alone, and that adds to the damage. So we certainly are not tornado free at this point, and some aspects of our emerging civilization have made us a little bit more vulnerable.
Yeah, for sure. Let me ask you this real quick, and that is, looking back, it looked like complacency may have played a role in the death toll from both the 2011 outbreak and the Joplin tornado. Also, maybe, the cry wolf syndrome that you hear about a lot when it comes to severe storms and tornadoes, particularly. Do you think we have an overwarning problem still when it comes to issuing, tornado warnings in general?
Well, we may have a bit of an overwarning problem. It's also a challenge, though. Joplin, for example, and El Reno tornado a couple years after that were situations where the whole radar pattern evolved so rapidly that you went from what you weren't even sure was a tornadic storm to one that all of a sudden is essentially EF5, and so the those kind of things almost necessitate that you put out warnings because you don't want to miss events and you need to have enough lead time for people to take take some kind of action. We also have a problem, though, that most homes are not properly anchored to the foundation, uh, and we have a lot of mobile homes, and of course, a lot of people are out in vehicles. So I think those are big problems. There may be a little bit of complacency, but we don't have structures that, in most cases, are capable of protecting us from the most violent of tornadoes if it's bad luck that you're hit by one of those.
Got you. Okay, so I'm going to change gears here real quick, Dr. Forbes. First of all, we've only got like a couple minutes left in this session. Are you okay if I stop this and then start another one? I don't want to steal too much of your time, but if you got another
Sure.
10 minutes, that'd be great. I just don't want to
Sure.
rush this. I think the
Yeah, no problem.
content that I think that the stuff that you're talking about is just so important. So I'd love to be able to expand just a little bit. So with that, let
Sure.
me bring this down. I'm going to send you another email, and then we'll just hop on the new recording. Okay.
All right, sounds great.
All right. Talk to you in a minute. Like I said, I've had this has been a fascination of mine my entire life. So if nothing else, yeah, for personal satisfaction for seeing that would be very cool. So thank you. All right. So you got to survey or you got to see the at least damage down in Brandenburg. Was that by air or were you actually on foot?
I was in Brandenburg after the fact on the ground with Dr. Fujita. We went to talk to I guess it was the newspaper publisher there, and get his get information from him about various stories and other people that might be able to tell us their experiences during that F5 tornado, as well as to just view it from the ground. It was part of a trip we made to Louisville and Brandenburg and some of the other adjacent areas. So Dr. Fujita and I were there on the ground.
Can you describe some of what you remember there in Brandenburg, particularly?
Well, it was pretty well wiped out. It was sort of up on the cliffs above on the west side or southwest side of the Ohio
Mhm.
River or south side of the Ohio River, and pretty well had been wiped out. That concentrated area of the town. Pretty much all the buildings had been demolished, and then there was the drop right down to the river. The tornado kept going up the other side then.
Yeah, reports from eyewitnesses that saw the Brandenburg tornadoes that crossed over the river. The reports were that the level of the Ohio River dropped dramatically in wake of the tornado, which is interesting.
Yeah, we were hearing that kind of story, trying to assess that. It could have potentially been, I suppose, just the force of the winds in opposite directions caused a brief pausing in the river. We were never totally sure uh, how to believe that. We heard about pools that were sucked dry. We're
Hmm.
never too sure whether or not, whether that was real phenomena or not. The one thing that came out of Brandenburg, now I think about a little bit, was we were interested in finding out, because of the suction swath hypotheses being places that had the worst damage. We were trying to pinpoint locations of people being killed and what were the nature of the injuries that caused the deaths. And what we found out from, particularly from Brandenburg, but other places as well, was that most of the deaths were from head injuries. And so that began the sequence of events where anytime Dr. Fujita would talk on television or go out to talk to the public somewhere, he would say one of the safety rules for tornadoes would be you should put on a helmet if you had one, because the fatal injuries are head injuries.
Yeah, and they started teaching kids to have
Yeah.
their textbook covering the backs of their head and necks, probably for the same reason. And then, what memories do you have from Louisville? Obviously, Louisville was devastated. Cherokee Park was annihilated. What are your thoughts of that? Also, Xenia, Ohio.
I never got to Xenia, Ohio, but the photographs of that were bad, and there was an interesting movie taken by a boy there. I forget his age, that showed these little tiny multiple funnels coming down. It was sort of like the photograph that you saw for the big tornado, and then you saw these little suction vortices that were causing the swaths of extreme damage across Xenia. Louisville, I did get there after the fact on the ground. Dr. Fujita and I were trying to both collect more information about the deaths, and in particular, we're very interested in the detailed pattern in that Cherokee Park, all the tree fall patterns. So we spent quite a bit of time looking at that, and then going to locations where photos and movies had been taken, so we could do the photogrammetry after the fact, to know the exact angle toward which the photograph was taken and the distance from the tornado, so that we could get things like size and orientation, and what part of the tornado path were they looking at with those photographs.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, very cool. Dr. Forbes, I want to make sure that we respect your time today, and certainly everything you've contributed here is fantastic. And I appreciate that. So before we bring this to a close, what do you want to, our viewers at home to be prepared for the next time we have a strike like this? Obviously, it's been a long time. It's been 11 years since the last F5, but we haven't had a major outbreak recently. But we know it's coming. So what advice do you have for our friends at home?
Well, I think the thing that I would advise is people need to be weather conscious, that the weather forecasting is good enough these days that we can usually see these big outbreaks, and they're the ones that usually have the multiples of these violent tornadoes within them. We can see those outbreaks coming days in advance. So periodically checking every day your weather forecast, and seeing if there is some kind of forecast for later on in the week of one of these big outbreaks, and then keep monitoring that, so that the day of the event, you already conditioned to be checking the weather frequently, looking out the window. You have some way of getting warnings on your cell phone. You have the television on, you have the weather channel on, something that will let you know that there is a rotating thunderstorm, probably with a tornado, heading your way, so that you can take action. And you need to think about in advance, where is your safe place to go in your home. If you don't have a home, if you're in a mobile home, make arrangements with a neighbor or some other place that you can go that is more sturdily built, so that you don't have to be thinking about all these things with minutes or even seconds to spare. You have to be proactive to try to save your own life.
Yeah, that's right. You want to kind of commit these to muscle memory. You want to
Yes.
have that
Yeah.
plan in
Very
place.
good.
You want to practice it so you don't have to think about it when the time is right.
Absolutely.
Okay, and then I guess generally, what other thoughts would you like to share? Considering your personal experience working with Dr. Fujita, this outbreak, what do you remember the most, and what final thoughts would you like to share?
Well, it was quite an opportunity working with Dr. Fujita, such a genius and such a legend in his field, developing the Fujita scale, predicting that there were suction vortices within tornadoes, and then going on to discover the microburst and downbursts. And I got to help set up his first field experiment that went on to prove that those microbursts existed using Doppler radars. Uh, and so working with him was an honor and a privilege, and just so exciting. What other graduate student gets to fly around in Cessna aircraft and then look at cloud tops from Learjets? And so there were just so many unique opportunities that was so enjoyable. I got my PhD, but at that point sort of overqualified myself for being an operational forecaster. That's kind of why
Right.
I had originally gone to Chicago to get my master's degree and go work at the Storm Prediction Center. But I was lucky enough to go get a faculty position at Penn State. I taught others for 20 years to be severe weather forecasters. Some of them went
Hmm.
on to do that. And then as I was nearing the age of 50, the Weather Channel decided to expand their expert team to include a severe storm tornado expert. And so I was actually, at the age of 50, lucky enough to be able to do what I had originally set out as a undergraduate student to do, to be a severe weather forecaster and be a part of so many big events there, including forecasting and covering the the Super Outbreak 2011. And so I've had an extremely interesting, extremely lucky career in the way that all the events unfolded to allow me to have that career, and so I'm very grateful for all of that, and have enjoyed all of that, and hopefully along the way I've saved a few lives. That was what I set out to do.
Yeah, I absolutely, and I have no doubt that you did just that. So very cool. Well, Dr. Forbes, it's been awesome talking to you today about this event, and well, thank you so much. I will be there at Cherokee Park on April 3rd, so I'll look forward to meeting you in person.
Yeah, as it turns out, I'm going to be there, Jeremy. So
Yeah,
yeah, I look forward to that.
fantastic. All right, Dr. Forbes, I appreciate you more than you know, and thanks so much for helping with this project.